Oh, you're right. I've been hearing this rubbish about global warming for so long, it's just driving me nuts. But uh, there's actually a cycle that's going on. It has nothing to do with humans. There's a cycle that was discovered back in the 1970s by a group called CLIMAP, Climate Long Range Investigation, Mapping, and Prediction. And there were about 200 different institutions and universities involved. It was spearheaded by people at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. What they did is they drilled deep cores into the ocean floor and pulled up sediments from the last 500,000 years. And they discovered that ice ages have returned almost like clockwork every 23,000 years, with a smaller ice age, if you will, every 11,500 years. If if scientists would put this well-known cycle into their computer models, we'd be seeing an entirely different scenario. We would be seeing that we're headed for an ice age. And this is, when we're saying colder or snowier, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be colder, but it's going to be snowier and a lot more precipitation. It's called the Milankovitch cycle. This is not something that, as I said, it's not something I discovered. It's called the Milankovitch cycle, and I think almost every geologist in the world has probably heard of that cycle.
Absolutely. The Earth axis completes one full cycle of the precessional approximately every 26,000 years. At the same time, the elliptical orbit rotates more slowly. Then the combined effects of the two precession leads to a 21 or so thousand year period between the seasons and the orbits. And this is connected to the Milankovitch cycle. But you mentioned obviously that there's a big kind of ice age and a minima one every 11,000 years or so. So which one do you think that we're kind of heading into here? The big one or the smaller one?
Well, the smaller one of 11,500 years ago killed about 40% of the larger animal species went extinct. So if we call that a small one, but it's the larger one that's due this time. It's the 23,000 year one. And by the way, as we enter into an ice age, it's marked by extremes, not just cold, not just snow, but extremes. So that in some areas of the world, for instance, there's a United Kingdom climatologist, H. Lamb, that wrote several books on this, but he was talking about there have been times as we entered little ice ages where there would be the worst drought in 500 years. And then later that year, in the same area, they would have the biggest snowstorms in 300 years. So same area, same location, same year, and yet you can have these extremes. So I see all of these extremes as yet another indication that that's where we're headed right now.
Now, I've seen in various media outlets that global warming is being blamed for even the cold weather that we're witnessing right now. How do you, how do you begin to approach the propaganda spinners in this situation, Robert?
Well, I put something on my website last week from Piers Corbyn. He's an astrophysicist based in London. And he says when people try to tell you that the global warming is causing global cooling, that it's BS, and he uses a stronger word than that. But it's just simply not true. As far as I'm concerned, it's just spinning it, trying to for several years they're telling us that global warming is causing global warming. Mm. Now they're saying global warming is causing global cooling. I guess maybe you don't want to go to Tahiti because probably that'll get really cold, right? It's rubbish. It's total rubbish.
So there's so many aspects obviously to this, and I think we need to discuss, what you believe in terms of areas and how severe it actually will be, and obviously when this is going to start happening as well. Are we just in the little beginning cusps of this? I mean, if I try to recall back, I think the last two winters now, with this one included, has been more severe than I can previously remember. Maybe when I was much younger, But it seems to be something is happening in the last 2 years. How long have you been seeing this, that it's on the rise in terms of the potential ice age, Robert?
Well, what I've been seeing, well, of course, I started researching this back in 1991. So I'd say since 1991, I've been saying that it's on its way. The book, the first edition of the book came out in 1997, and when I started doing interviews at that time, I said that I think we will be admitting that we're entering an ice age within 20 years. With that said, it's really hard to say exactly, but I do think that we are seeing the beginnings. Some of the reasons being is that our entry into previous ice ages has been a time when precipitation has increased dramatically, and at least in the United States, precipitation has increased by 20% just since the 1970s. That's dramatic. I know that in the last few years we've had record snowfall in more than 30 countries, including the United States. This winter, the United Kingdom so far is having their worst winter in 1,000 years. So to me, the indications are there.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think are some of the areas that will be hit worse? Is it going to be as simple as those who are closer to the Arctic Circle and Antarctica? Those will be hit harder, or are we looking at something else possibly happening here? We also obviously at the same time have a kind of a magnetic reversal that seems to be happening. We're here rather about that the magnetic North Pole is moving towards Russia. Is this going to destabilize the whole axis tilt of the Earth, or what do you think some of the consequences will be here, Robert?
I don't think it's going to destabilize the axis tilt of the Earth. I know a lot of people talk about a pole shift. I don't go there. Now, I do talk about the magnetic reversal where compasses will point toward Antarctica instead of toward the Arctic. I don't personally believe that the Earth will tip upside down, although there are a lot of people that are saying that could happen. But yes, my studies, and this is controversial. A lot of scientists do not agree with me, but my research shows that we have what's called a magnetic excursion, which is like a mini magnetic reversal, but those show up in the record in sync with the Ice Age cycle. Is 11,500 years ago we had the Gothenburg magnetic reversal, and we entered a period of glaciation known as the Younger Dryas. 23,000 years ago, we had a magnetic reversal. It was called the Mono Lake magnetic reversal, and we had catastrophic glaciation. 33,500 years ago, we had the Lake Mungo magnetic reversal. Again, we entered a period of glaciation. That, just by coincidence? I don't think so. That's when the Neanderthal went extinct. So there are many, and 115,000 years ago, that was the end of what's called the Eemian period, which was a period of warmth even warmer than today. It lasted about 10,000 years. Then 115,000 years ago, we had the Blake magnetic reversal, and lo and behold, we entered a catastrophic ice age. And this happened so quickly. But anyway, there are some scientists out there who will tell you that the last magnetic reversal was 780,000 years ago. I don't know why they're ignoring all of these other reversals.
But yeah, because, this whole question about ice ages and so forth as well, I only think back what I heard in school, what I've seen mentioned on documentaries, TV programs. They're always talking about ice ages lasting for hundreds and thousands of years, if not even millions of years. I can't even recall what they exactly said in terms of number, but it's a heck of a lot longer than the numbers that you're mentioning here. Why is that, Robert?
Well, officially we've been in an ice age for I guess several thousand years because right now the Earth is cooler than it has been during many of the years of history. But No, I show mini ice ages, little ice ages, about every 360 years. I show these other quote smaller ice ages about every 11,500 years. Then there is a cycle of even larger ice ages that comes about approximately every 105,000 years. And that correlates with something called orbital stretch. All of these things have to do with totally natural cycles. But our orbit around the sun, we think of it as we just circle around the sun. But our orbit around the sun is not circular, it's elliptical. So sometimes we're closer to the sun than others. The orbit starts as near a perfect circle, then it stretches out to an ellipse, then it comes back to nearly a perfect circle. That process takes approximately 105,000 years. And ice ages, the larger ice ages, the named ice ages, such as the Wisconsin and the Nebraskan, and I think in Europe they're called the Worm. I don't remember the names, but those recur approximately every 105,000 years. All of those cycles are now due, every single one of them. So I can be off a little bit on the years, but the fact is they're all due, regardless of what humans do or don't do.
So might we still be talking about? When we scale it up in this sense, a few hundred years here and there are not that much. Do you think we still could be 100 years away from this when it really starts hitting? Is that a possibility? Do you think?
It's a possibility, except for one thing. When you're looking at the 105,000 year cycle, of course, that could be 1,000 years away. When you look at the 11,500 year cycle, sure, that could still be a ways away. But when you look at the smaller cycle, the little ice age cycle, that one is due. That one is due now, and so because that one's a lot easier to keep track of. So I do believe that we're headed into it now, and then when you put some other things on top of that, is that you look at the sunspots cycle, which is now the lowest that it's been in over 100 years, and you remember that there's something called the Maunder minimum. And you had mentioned the magnetic reversals earlier. What I'm talking about here is magnetic reversals on the sun, the sunspot cycle. These little ice ages seem to occur in sync with the sunspot cycle. There was a time back in the 1600s called the Maunder minimum, when we had almost no sunspots for a period of about 50 years. And we descended into a little ice age. Well, now we're having a similar period of little sunspots. There's a Russian scientist, he's an astrophysicist, Habibullo Abdusamatov, who I was lucky enough to be in Chicago last May when he was speaking at a climate convention. And based on the sunspot cycle, Dr. Abdusamatov thinks that we will be entering a little ice age by the year 2014, or that we'll be admitting it. But he thinks we're already headed that way right now. I agree with him.
So we're back to the sun again, obviously, and the cycles of the sun. What is it now? Is it every 11 year we have sunspot cycles come and go? And is that also when the magnetic poles flip on the sun? Is that correct, Robert?
Yes, the sunspot cycle is that changes, the magnetic inclination of the sunspot changes, and when it does change, of course, we have all those explosions on the sun. But now it's not exactly 11 years. It can vary down to 6 years, but it's an average of about 11 years that the sunspot cycle changes. Now, scientists, NASA had been predicting that the sunspot cycle that we're in now was going to be a real doozy, and instead it's only about 50% or less of what they had predicted. So something is going on with the sun that certainly not everybody understands at all.
Yeah. Exactly, because this is what I've heard as well. Everybody's waiting for it to kick up here in 2012, around that time, something like that, maybe a little bit later now, they say. Is that still a possibility? It could be late, so to speak, for another reason, or are we simply not going to enter into an activity zone in terms of the sun, Robert? And obviously, if not, what is the further consequences of that?
Well, obviously, if NASA doesn't know, I don't know, but
right.
but based on the previous cycles, I don't think it's going to increase very much at all. And you were asking earlier about what areas are going to be affected. That is still hard to tell, because right now the jet stream is not doing what it's, quote, supposed to be doing. So scientists just don't quite understand what's going on, but the jet stream gets locked into various places, and it's taking, well, for instance, the southeastern United States down as far as Florida has been freezing this year, and Alabama, Mississippi, areas that are not supposed to get snow have been getting huge snowstorms, and these were not really forecast, except there's an astrophysicist in London, Piers Corbyn again, who studies the sun, and he has been predicting those. So I guess if you know what you're looking for, it's predictable, but the United Kingdom Meteorological Office, the Met Office, has been making their predictions based on their global warming beliefs and based on CO2 levels, and they have been failing miserably. They've got to stop looking at the CO2 levels. Do not cause global warming. CO2 levels are a result of what is going on, not a cause.
That's right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard somewhere that Piers Corbyn is looking at some kind of a 100-year cycle. Isn't that correct? He's found something with the 100-year cycle?
I guess I haven't heard that one yet. Maybe. By the way, I was lucky enough, last year I was in London, and I was lucky enough to have dinner with Piers. My wife and I were lucky enough to have dinner with Piers and his wife. It was a wonder. It was. I really think this guy is brilliant, and I hope people start listening more to him. But no, I had not heard of that 100-year cycle.
Maybe I'm getting that wrong, because I just recently actually heard about him, and I saw some reports, and obviously this is all some of the reports that you're reading about Piers Corbyn is going to be all upside down, because obviously the media is attempting to smear him in different ways and what have you. So I might have read a faulty report or something like that when it comes to Piers's work. Or
you may be right. I just haven't seen it.
Right. But he's been kind of somewhat a laughing stock for a few years, I think, what I've heard. But now, obviously, they're beginning to look twice at him again, because it's turning out that he's correct on many of the points that he was talking about years ago.
Yes, well, the thing is this is all driven by natural cycles. It has nothing to do with humans. I think we're being arrogant when we say that we can control the weather. There's a small volcano in the United States, Mount St. Helens, that erupted in 1980, and I was lucky enough. I've visited Mount St. Helens a couple of times, and when you see the devastation that thing caused, hundreds of square miles of trees with 3-foot diameter just knocked over like matchsticks, and when you look at the devastation that tiny volcano created, and then think that humans could even begin to match that devastation is nuts. That little volcano has pumped more CO2 into the atmosphere than humans in Washington State have pumped into it in over 100 years. So to blame humans, I think, is just plain wrong.
I've been saying for a while now that I think that CO2 would actually aid along in the potentiality that we're heading into an ice age. I don't know how much effect human beings would have, but if anything, then if we look at it from that point of view, it would actually, maybe try to prevent that a tiny little bit. In other words, we should be, I'm not suggesting that we should all put on our cars. There's, toxicity in what we're doing there, but I'm saying that CO2 shouldn't be frowned upon the way it is right now, because that could actually be a lifesaver, if you know what I mean, Robert.
Oh, yeah, I think we're going to need all of the food we can get. That's one of the big things I worry about is, and in my book, Not by Fire, but by Ice, I say that I fear that we'll be fighting in the streets for food long before we're covered by ice.
Really?
Because
Yeah.
this is going to destroy the crops. And so, yes, we're going to need that CO2. You know, in history, CO2 rises because oceans warm. It's not the other way around. The CO2 does not raise temperature levels, but when the oceans are a CO2 sink. So when the oceans get cooler, they absorb CO2. When they warm up, then they release CO2. Anybody who's ever made homemade beer or homemade root beer has probably seen this. If the root beer or the beer warms up, then the bottle explodes because it's releasing CO2. You know, if CO2 would heat things up, then I think some enterprising entrepreneur would have developed CO2 stove. You know, just pump CO2 in there and heat your coffee, right?
Right.
but it does not work that way. I think, and this I think will be one of my contributions eventually, but I think underwater volcanoes are heating the seas, and that they raise the temperature of the seas, and then the CO2 is released. That is where I think it's coming from.
I see. And any theory about what actually drives the underwater volcanoes then?
I'm back to the magnetic reversals. I believe, and again, this is my theory, but as far as I can see, is tectonic forces are driven by electromagnetic forces. As we head toward a magnetic reversal, our magnetic field strength declines. And as our magnetic field strength declines, what I see happening, and this has certainly happened in the past, as our magnetic field strength declines, tectonic activity increases. That's earthquake activity and volcanic activity. Well, right now, earthquake activity has been increasing substantially. Volcanic activity is the worst since Christopher Columbus, and seems to still be increasing. And that's the volcanic activity in that we can see. That's the above water volcanic activity.
Yeah.
Well, I would assume that if above water volcanic activity is increasing, underwater volcanic activity should also be increasing.
Now, just a few days ago, or basically we hear a little bit stories here about Yellowstone, and scientists are beginning to looking closer at this now. And they have been for quite a while now, but even in the last few days, something has changed. Do you know what's going on there, Robert?
Well, in the last, I don't know about the last few days, but I know that in the last 10 years, the ground around Yellowstone has risen by 10 inches, which is a considerable amount. Now, Yellowstone, for people who don't know, Yellowstone is a super volcano. And by the way, the last major eruption of Yellowstone, which was about 640,000 years ago, correlates with a magnetic reversal known as the Big Lost magnetic reversal. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's just an accident or just a coincidence. There was its latest eruption. It was not a supervolcanic eruption, but its latest eruption was about 70,000 years ago. And again, that lined up with the precessionary cycle that we were talking about.
Right.
So, and with the magnetic reversal. So I don't think this is accidental, that volcanic activity increases dramatically at magnetic reversals. What I see is that as it increases, the underwater volcanoes heat the seas, and then the oceans, they start to evaporate. All of that moisture rises into the sky, and is rising into a sky that has been cooled by the above water volcanoes, and so it results in massive amounts of snow. So you've got warming oceans and cooler skies. To me, that's a deadly recipe.
Canada, Scandinavia, England, obviously Northern Europe, parts of Northern Europe, and northern parts of Russia and China. Obviously, they would be the most places, just from the top of my head, that would be not good places to be at then, basically, right?
I would think so. Yes, during the last ice age, many of the places you just mentioned were covered with up to 2 miles of ice, 2 miles straight up. In London, there were polar bears that were roaming the outskirts of London. Now, but in Alaska, which you would think would be another place that would be covered with ice, a lot of Alaska was not covered with ice. I think it had to do with the prevailing winds off of the Pacific Ocean. Another place that was not covered, and this is surprising, and a lot of this has been an enigma to many scientists, but during the last ice age, the Arctic Ocean had almost no more ice than it has right now. Mm-hmm. And they haven't understood it, because Canada was covered with 2 miles of ice, and yet the Arctic Ocean stayed about the same. Well, I go back to the underwater volcanoes again. The Arctic Ocean is filled with underwater volcanoes. There's an underwater mountain ridge there called the Gackel Ridge. It's about 1,100 miles long. It's bigger than the Alps. Some of the mountains are 3 miles high, and yet they're still a half a mile underwater. But a few years ago, the Max Planck Institute decided to do some investigation there, and they sent submersibles down to look at some of those underwater volcanoes there in the Arctic Ocean, which they figured were going to be extinct. And instead, those underwater volcanoes were so active that they had to be careful that they didn't melt the cables of their submersible vehicles. Mm-hmm. So that is what I think is keeping the Arctic Ocean warm now, not humans, and that is what I think did it many years ago. But in the meantime, the other oceans will lower. So that's another thing to bring up, is that there's a scientist, Nils Axel Morner. I think he's from Sweden. I'm not sure.
Sounds like it.
But yeah. Okay, but I got to meet him in Chicago at the climate convention in May. Also, he is a sea level expert. He has been studying sea levels for 30 years. He and actively going around the world and looking and measuring. That's his job. That's his business. And he says that sea levels are not rising. That's in direct conflict with what you hear from so many of the global warming enthusiasts. Now, this man who's probably the world's greatest expert on sea levels says they are not rising. But during the previous ice ages, during the last one, sea levels were 370 feet lower than they are today. That's where all of the moisture came from to build up those huge ice sheets. Mm-hmm. I expect we're going to see sea levels dropping, and they may already be dropping, if we could get some honest answers.
He is indeed a Swedish, Nils Axel Mörner. He's actually the former head of the Paleogeophysics and Geodynamics department at Stockholm University. So that's a name to look into then in terms of that. And that's probably why we haven't heard about him up here as well, because that's not politically correct at the moment, obviously, to go ahead of that. So
no, he is. Yeah, you would probably like to be able to interview him if you could, because he is the world's expert.
All right, excellent. Need to look into that name as well. And this, when you mentioned this about the Arctic Ocean, I also think about some of the reports that came out a few years ago where it was discovered that Greenland was once subtropical as well. Evidence for lush plant life and things like this as well. Now, I don't remember from the top of my head exactly what period the scientists were looking at here, but I guess this is something you've heard as well, Robert, about.
That would have been millions and millions and millions of years ago. But yes, because of plate tectonics, all of the various continents are moving about 3/4 of an inch per year. They move about as fast as a fingernail grows. But you put that over millions and millions of years, and many areas of the world would have been in a different place than they are now. But certainly when Leif Erikson discovered Greenland, it was warmer then than it is now. In fact, I hear all of this talk about global warming, but there's a geologist in Washington State who, I'll think of his name in a minute, but he has studied the last 11,000 years from the end of the last ice age, and he says that right now is actually something like there have been more than 9,000 of those years that were warmer than today. Mm-hmm. So to say that we're having unbelievable global warming is just a flat lie, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, yeah.
Just a flat lie. It is now cooler than it has been for the last 11,000 years.
And obviously, just a reminder to our listeners as well. Just remember the Climate Gate situation here with the climate research unit from East Anglia University, and they'll give you a hint here, obviously, about what we're faced with in terms of the propaganda and the lies as well, obviously, about global warming, right, Robert?
Yes, I just remembered his name. I just scrolled down on my website here. His name is Dr. Don Easterbrook. Mm-hmm, yeah. And it says 2010. Where does this fit in the warmest year list? We are 9,099. I mean, it's just so incredible that we could call this global warming. Yeah. The only way you can call it global warming, even in the last 100 years, it was warmer in the 1930s than it is now. It's incredible how somehow we're able to call this global warming when it's actually global cooling.
Yeah, absolutely. You are correct.
And the glaciers, we see all of these pictures of the glaciers melting, and yet 99% of the world's glaciers are growing. And we're inundated with pictures and sob stories about them melting.
That's right.
They should be melting. That's if we're not in an ice age. But the fact is that they've begun growing again. We have glaciers are growing in so many different countries right now. Maybe not in Sweden, I don't know, but glaciers are growing in the United States, and you probably don't hear about that. Glaciers are growing in Antarctica. Mm-hmm. In West Antarctica, which is a peninsula, they've been melting, yes, because that peninsula sticks out into the ocean. But the rest of Antarctica, eastern Antarctica, which is by far the bigger, they're growing. Glaciers are growing in Alaska. Glaciers are growing in France. Mont Blanc is the tallest mountain in France. Glaciers are growing there. The last I heard, all 50 glaciers in New Zealand were growing. Again, we're not hearing about. You've probably heard about the so-called melting glaciers in the Himalayas.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, there are probably 15,000 glaciers in the Himalayas, and they're basing the idea that they're melting on a study of around 200 glaciers. Mm-hmm. Well, I have the names of 200 glaciers in the Himalayas that are actually growing. And this includes K2. It includes the Mount Everest. Glaciers are growing. Glaciers. I hear about the small glaciers that are supposedly melting in South America, and yet in Chile the Pio 11 glacier is growing. In Argentina, that's the largest glacier in Chile. In Argentina, the Perito Moreno glacier is growing. That's the largest glacier in Argentina. But every time you hear about a glacier that's growing, the article will say that this is unusual because all of the rest of the world's glaciers are melting. Well, that's not true.
Right. So they are growing probably then in a majority of places, but in certain other areas, they might be melting then, and this is what the media is choosing to focus on. Is that what you're saying, Robert?
That's what I'm saying. The other thing that I see is they show pictures of glaciers calving, and it makes it look like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. People need to understand that that's what glaciers do.
That happens every year, right?
Every year, because glaciers are plastic. I mean, it's frozen water, and it's controlled by gravity. So the snow builds up in the high areas of the glacier and makes the glacier heavier, and so then the glacier pushes out at the sides and it calves as the ice breaks off.
Yeah.
This is totally normal. This has been going on for millions of years, has nothing to do with either global warming or global cooling. It's just something that glaciers do. So, but they show these pictures, and you say, oh my God, the world is coming to an end.
That's
Not
right.
true.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, you mentioned the jet stream earlier not behaving correctly. What do you make of the Gulf Stream then? Do you see that everything is all right with that? We hear some wild stories here and there that it's actually been shutting down or beginning to slow down. What do you think about all this, Robert?
I've heard that. I've been trying to avoid that, but
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to have to put it on my website. Yes, there's an Italian geologist, I think his name is Zangari, who says that the Gulf current in the Gulf of Mexico has stopped because of the BP oil spill.
Mm-hmm.
And he says in turn that is going to shut down the Gulf current, the one that goes to Europe, which does keep Europe a lot warmer. And again, he's blaming that on the BP oil spill. I think this is just another way. He may not be doing it on purpose, I don't know, but this is just another way to blame humans. So now they got it covered both ways. If it's global warming, it's humans' fault. If it's global cooling, well, BP caused it. No, this is part of the natural cycle. As near as I can tell, and I misplaced this article. I read an article by scientists in the United Kingdom that have been studying the Gulf Stream for years. They say that it hasn't changed, but I'm sorry to say I didn't keep that paper, so I can't back it up. But the thing that I would say is that apparently the Gulf Stream has slowed down prior to other glaciations,
mm-hmm.
and they say that comes as a result of more and more fresh water going into the Atlantic, which mixes with the salt water and keeps that conveyor belt from working properly.
Right.
Again, they're trying to blame humans. And I say, no, it has to do with those underwater volcanoes in the Arctic Ocean that are doing some heating there. But the other part is that it has to do with all of the underwater volcanoes heating the seas. And, well, for instance, the United States, precipitation has increased 20%, as I said earlier, in the last, since 1970s. Well, that does create more precipitation. That moves more fresh water into the ocean, into the Atlantic. And that could have something to do with it. But again, I think it's a totally natural cycle. It's happened before when humans weren't here. So why should this be any different?
Yeah. So precipitation, is that then, do you think, happening globally? Is it, as you say, more freshwater in the cycle overall now, or is it just being taken from elsewhere and so consequently we have drought in one place and then almost flooding in another?
Until I get an honest answer as to whether the ocean levels are dropping or not, I don't think I can answer that.
Okay.
I'm hoping you can talk to Niels Axel Morner, because I think that some areas of the world that actually ocean levels are beginning to drop a little bit, which would be an indication that then we will start getting more and more ice accumulating. That's how ice ages come. Is ice ages aren't necessarily that much colder. It's that they have more precipitation in the winter.
I see. So it keeps on snowing, and this accumulates in some way then. Yeah.
For an example I'll give is Seattle, Washington, in the United States. Seattle, during the last ice age, was covered by about 4,000 feet of ice, 4/5 of a mile, straight up. And yet, and that ice only extended as far south as Olympia, Washington, which is only about 50 miles south of Seattle. 100 miles south of Olympia, it was only about 7 degrees colder than it is right now. So it's and at the same time the tropics and subtropics temperatures were almost the same as today. So it's not that it gets colder during an ice age. It's that we get more precipitation in the winter. That is the thing to watch for. So global warming, global cooling, if we get that precipitation in the winter, look out.
So we might enter a time soon here when all the snow doesn't completely melt even during summer. I mean, this will probably at the beginning be fairly high north then, but if this increases, it might maybe slowly go further south from the point of view of being in the northern hemisphere then, right?
Yeah, and as you start to see the glaciers grow, and I think you're going to see glaciers grow and more each year, because there'll be more snow that accumulates during the winter than does melt. That's how they grow. Then yes, I think you'll be seeing the beginning of an ice age. Now, right now, for anybody who's listening to this in the United States, they probably are not aware or may not be aware that glaciers are growing in the United States right now. But because that does not get put into the newspapers in the United States at all. Mm-hmm. But in Washington State, there's the Nisqually Glacier, which had been melting. I agree it had. Now, I've visited the Nisqually Glacier twice. The Nisqually Glacier is now advancing, but nobody bothers to tell you. On Mount Rainier also, the Emmons Glacier is growing. In California, which everybody thinks of as being very warm, but there's Mount Shasta in California that has 7 glaciers. All 7 glaciers on Mount Shasta are growing. Of course, the local newspapers say that's because of global warming, but there are many glaciers that are growing that way. But every time you read about it, this is so unusual. This is a one-time deal. Well, no, it's not a one-time deal. Glaciers are growing, and that's because they're getting that precipitation in the winter that's falling as snow.
You mentioned the Arctic Ocean, and obviously in that area we have the recently put up global seed vault on the island of Svalbard, north of Norway. And you mentioned that food will be potentially the issue in the future. Does anybody know what they're doing here?
I think they're going to be buried in ice.
Okay.
I don't think that food vault is. I don't remember. I put an article about that on my website several months ago. But yeah, I think that food vault. It's a great idea if they would put it somewhere else, but I think it's going to get buried in ice.
So it potentially won't be a region up there where actually it's going to be ice-free because of volcanic activity from the Arctic Ocean. That's not a possibility, do you think?
Well, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That's a very good point. I guess one would have to look at specifically at that area to see what happened during the last ice age. That is a very good. Maybe it'll hang in there. That's a very good point.
Something to keep an eye on then potentially there, because I've always been interested in why they chose to place it there. I know that there's other seed vaults around the world, obviously, but this one received so much attention because it was called even the Doomsday, seed vault and all that. But
yes,
all right, yeah, interesting. So this is there's so many other aspects, obviously, to this and some of the effects, what might happen. And obviously in the next hour, when we take a little break in a while here, Robert, I want to focus more obviously on the whole magnetic reversal aspect, and obviously talk about this from the point of view of your book as well, that goes into the idea of evolutionary leaps, which is fascinating in itself. But if we look a little bit more about the on the climate and so forth as well, we had a period called the medieval warm period as well, where there's stories that people were growing wine or making wine and growing grapes all the way up to Scotland so far as well. That's perfectly explainable, I guess, in the cycle of things. And if we're going to enter another warm period, how long is that away from us at this point, Robert?
Well, I think the medieval warm period is certainly explainable as being part of this same cycle. Then we'd be going back to that little ice age cycle, but where I see that we head into a little ice age about every 360 years. So, in other words, we will also have a warm period in between there about every 360 years. So, again, on my website, I have iceagenow.com, but I have a chart, if you go there and scroll down just a little bit, that has a graph showing the temperatures for about the last 16,000 years. And it shows the very low temperatures that occurred during the younger Dryas cooling period, which and then it shows how about 10,500 years ago it began to warm up, and it does even shows a period about 8,200 years ago of cooling, and then it shows warmth zigzags. And again, these zigzags go with the sunspot cycle and with the precession of the equinoxes and with orbital. Well, this is too small a cycle to go with orbital stretch, but this actually does show the medieval warm period, and then it got cool right after the medieval warm period. It cooled down to about lower than it is today, and then it warmed up again, and then it cooled down. But these are, I can prove cooling if you'll give me a short enough cycle, a short enough period. I can find periods of cooling anywhere in the geologic record, or I can find periods of warming. It just depends on what time frame we pick. But most of it has been warmer than today.
Weather and climate is obviously a complicated, cycle to study as well. We have people who are trying to predict weather by running models and things like that, and they try to plug everything in. But if they miss one thing, then the whole model might go out the window, so to speak. And there might as well also be might have been anomalies historically, and might even be in the future because of the random rogue volcano going off here and there. That's a possibility too, right? We might have a planetary upheaval in one way or another because of whatever happens either on the planet directly, or maybe even some people have speculated that volcanoes that might even be driven by the sun and other cosmic radiation, but we can leave that to the side if we want to. But a random volcano powerful enough that could change quite a few years on a climactic scale, right, Robert?
Well, they could, but I'm not sure that's so random. Is I think that as scientists are able to study magnetic reversals more, I think they'll find out that volcanic activity increases in sync with the magnetic reversal cycle. I think they'll find that as magnetic field strength declines, the tectonic activity increases. So I don't think it's quite as random as we might believe. I think it'll be run by the same cycle. So that'll be another way to see if we're going to be heading into an ice age. For instance, if Yellowstone should erupt, I would say that we would be we'd be in an ice age within 2 months probably. Or if Krakatoa now, sure. So those are random. I mean, Krakatoa erupted 1883 and created huge damage. So yes, they can be random, but I think that the big part of it is not random. During the younger Dryas, for instance, when we entered into the small ice age, comparatively small, when the mammoths went extinct and the mastodons went extinct and the saber-toothed cat and the short-faced bear and the great dire wolf, when all of those went extinct, volcanic activity went crazy at that time. They have found in Alaska, for instance, mammoth bones interspersed with up to a meter of volcanic ash. Mm-hmm. So it all ties together. We are living really in a comparatively benign time,
right?
during what's called the interglacials, which last about 10,000 years, we have relatively benign weather. We have, it's kind of warm and civilizations increase. But then during the next 90,000 years, we have more climatic extremes. And our 10,000 years is about over.
So it's a little window that's pretty interesting. So, but the mechanics of this that you mentioned obviously is simply that volcanic ash would block out the sunlight, right, and consequently cooler weather.
Well, but at the same time, the last time Yellowstone erupted, it dropped 10 feet of ash over a lot of the United States. Mm-hmm. Now, and that ash. It's not like the ash from your fireplace. That ash has glass particles in it, and it's a lot heavier than snow. So that ash, 10 feet of ash, is going to collapse every roof for hundreds of square miles.
Yeah.
But that ash is going to cover the crops. That ash is going to can you imagine 10 feet of ash landing on the rivers and on the lakes? And then all of that ash washes into the ocean. So you're out of food almost instantaneously. And then you've got all of that ash cooling down the skies, and at the same time, I would expect underwater volcanoes to be going crazy. So they would be heating the oceans, pumping ever more moisture into skies that have been cooled. That's a recipe for disaster. Now, when I started writing this book, when I started researching it in 1991, scientists thought there were about 10,000 underwater volcanoes in the entire world. They said that there 80% of all of the world's volcanoes were underwater. Well, that was 1991. Then in 1993, scientists discovered another 1,100 underwater volcanoes off the coast of Easter Island. So in just a matter of months, they increased the world's supply of underwater volcanoes by 10%. Well, that was 1993. Now, NASA estimates there may be as many as 3 million underwater volcanoes.
Wow.
And it's incredible.
Yeah.
Now, they don't know. We know more about the moon still than we know about underwater volcanoes.
Yeah.
But they're estimating that of those 3 million, that several thousand are active. Several thousand is not a very precise term, but that's what they're estimating, several thousand that are active. Now, they are pumping lava into the seas that is 2,300 degrees hot, 10 times the boiling point. As far as I'm concerned, that is what is heating the seas. And as we see above water volcanic activity increase, I think we'll also see underwater volcanic activity increase.
All right. I'm going to shoot off one more question here for you, Robert, and then we can take a little break and continue talking more in our next segment. But do you think that today's desert areas might become more lush in the future with precipitation that you mentioned before? Or do you think there will be, I guess, sandwich between ice and sand, in the future?
I think we'll probably have the same amount of desert areas, and I'm guessing, but I think we'll have the same amount, but the line will move. With that said, though, I know that during the last ice age, the American Southwest was a lot wetter than it is now. So I'm not going to claim to be an expert there, but I do know the American Southwest, which is very dry now, was a lot wetter. So you may be right. I don't know.
All right. We'll just have to see if we are still here at that point, obviously, and how quick all of this will unfold, and if it goes according to the theories here that we've been talking about with Robert Felix. You are the author of Not by Fire, But by Ice, and also your latest one is called Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps. We're going to talk and focus more on the second book here in our next segment for our members, but we want to get out the websites, obviously, as well. IceAgeNow.com, that's the main website for the first book, and then you're also, I don't know how recently you started up the second website here, Robert, evolutionaryleaps.com, and you have quite a busy news sections on both of these sites where you track and follow this as stories unfold. Isn't that right as well?
Yes, I try to update. Well, I update IceAgeNow.com every single day, and I update EvolutionaryLeaps.com probably a couple of times a week. So yes, there's usually new material there.
Excellent. And is there anything else you want to mention or run by our listeners here before we take a little break for the first segment, Robert? So, or what do you think some of the consequences will be here, Robert?
I don't think it's going to destabilize the axis tilt of the Earth. I know a lot of people talk about a pole shift. I don't go there. Now, I do talk about the magnetic reversal where compasses will point toward Antarctica instead of toward the Arctic. I don't personally believe that the Earth will tip upside down, although there are a lot of people that are saying that could happen. But yes, my studies, and this is controversial. A lot of scientists do not agree with me, but my research shows that we have what's called a magnetic excursion, which is like a mini magnetic reversal, but those show up in the record in sync with the Ice Age cycle. Is 11,500 years ago we had the Gothenburg magnetic reversal, and we entered a period of glaciation known as the Younger Dryas. 23,000 years ago, we had a magnetic reversal. It was called the Mono Lake magnetic reversal, and we had catastrophic glaciation. 33,500 years ago, we had the Lake Mungo magnetic reversal. Again, we entered a period of glaciation. That, just by coincidence? I don't think so. That's when the Neanderthal went extinct. So there are many, and 115,000 years ago, that was the end of what's called the Eemian period, which was a period of warmth even warmer than today. Oh, you're right. I've been hearing this rubbish about global warming for so long, it's just driving me nuts. But there's actually a cycle that's going on. It has nothing to do with humans. There's a cycle that was discovered back in the 1970s by a group called CLIMAP, Climate Long Range Investigation, Mapping, and Prediction. And there were about 200 different institutions and universities involved. It was spearheaded by people at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. What they did is they drilled deep cores into the ocean floor and pulled up sediments from the last 500,000 years, and they discovered that ice ages have returned almost like clockwork every 23,000 years, with a smaller ice age, if you will, every 11,500 years. If scientists would put this well-known cycle into their computer models, we'd be seeing an entirely different scenario. We would be seeing that we're headed for an ice age. And this is, when we're saying colder or snowier, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be colder, but it's going to be snowier and a lot more precipitation. It's called the Milankovitch cycle. This is not something that, as I said, it's not something I discovered. It's called the Milankovitch cycle, and I think almost every geologist in the world has probably heard of that cycle.
Absolutely. The Earth axis completes one full cycle of the precessional approximately every 26,000 years, at even the cold weather that we're witnessing right now. How do you how do you begin to approach the propaganda spinners in this situation, Robert?
Well, I put something on my website last week from Piers Corbyn. He's an astrophysicist based in London. And he says when people try to tell you that the global warming is causing global cooling, that it's BS, and he uses a stronger word than that. But it's just simply not true. As far as I'm concerned, it's just spinning it, trying to for several years they're telling us that global warming is causing global warming. Now they're saying global warming is causing global cooling. I guess maybe you don't want to go to Tahiti because probably that'll get really cold, right? It's rubbish. It's total rubbish.
So there's so many aspects obviously to this, and I think we need to discuss, what you believe in terms of areas and how severe it actually will be, and obviously when this is going to start happening as well. Are we just in the little beginning cusps of this? I mean, if I try to recall back, I think the last 2 winters now, with this one included, has been more severe than I can previously remember. Maybe when I was much younger, but it seems to be something is happening in the last 2 years. How long have you been seeing this, that it's on the rise in terms of the potential ice age, Robert?
Well, what I've been seeing, well, of course, I started researching this back in 1991. So
at the same time, the elliptical orbit rotates more slowly. Then the combined effects of the two precession leads to a 21 or so thousand-year period between the seasons and the orbits, and this is connected to the Milankovitch cycle. But you mentioned obviously that there's a big kind of ice age and a minima one every 11,000 years or so. So which one do you think that we're kind of heading into here, the big one or the smaller one?
Well, the smaller one of 11,500 years ago killed about 40% of the larger animal species went extinct. So if we call that a small one, but it's the larger one that's due this time. It's the 23,000-year one. And by the way, as we enter into an ice age, it's marked by extremes, not just cold, not just snow, but extremes. So that in some areas of the world, for instance, there's a United Kingdom climatologist, H. Lamb, that wrote several books on this, but he was talking about there have been times as we entered little ice ages where there would be the worst drought in 500 years. And then later that year, in the same area, they would have the biggest snowstorms in 300 years. So same area, same location, same year, and yet you can have these extremes. So I see all of these extremes as yet another indication that that's where we're headed right now.
Now, I've seen in various media outlets that global warming is being blamed for.
I'd say since 1991, I've been saying that it's on its way. The book, the first edition of the book came out in 1997, and when I started doing interviews at that time, I said that I think we will be admitting that we're entering an ice age within 20 years. With that said, it's really hard to say exactly, but I do think that we are seeing the beginnings. Some of the reasons being is that our entry into previous ice ages has been a time when precipitation has increased dramatically. And at least in the United States, precipitation has increased by 20% just since the 1970s. That's dramatic. I know that in the last few years we've had record snowfall in more than 30 countries, including the United States. This winter, the United Kingdom so far is having their worst winter in 1,000 years. So to me, the indications are there. Yeah,
absolutely. And what do you think are some of the areas that will be hit worse? Is it going to be as simple as those who are closer to the Arctic Circle and Antarctica? Those will be hit harder, or are we looking at something else possibly happening here? We also obviously at the same time have a kind of a magnetic reversal that seems to be happening. We're here rather about that the magnetic North Pole is moving towards Russia. Is this going to destabilize the whole axis tilt of the Earth?